The letter was already in her hands when Hester Ford realized she was shaking. Not from the cold, though the September wind had teeth sharp enough to cut through her worn calico dress. Not from hunger, though she had not eaten since yesterday morning. She was shaking because the handwriting on the outside of that envelope was her dead husband's, and the man standing on her porch, a stranger with road dust caked into every crease of his face and eyes the color of deep river water, had just told her something that rearranged every truth she had built her life around for the past 2 years. He was not dead when he wrote it, Oscar Holloway said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a man who had rehearsed those words 1,000 times across the Kansas plains. He was alive in Laramie when he put that letter in my hands and asked me to bring it to you. I promised him I would. That was in Colorado. Hester stared at him. The porch boards creaked beneath her feet. Behind her, through the thin walls of the farmhouse, she could hear her daughter Lily humming something tuneless and innocent. "You said Colorado," she said slowly. "That is 2 states away. 3, actually." He pulled his hat from his head and held it against his chest. His dark hair was matted with sweat and grime, and there was a healing cut along his jawline that had not yet faded to scar. "I came through Colorado, then Kansas, then into the Oklahoma territory. Took me the better part of 4 months. 4 months. Hester's fingers pressed against the envelope until she could feel the edges of the folded paper inside. 4 months this man had carried her dead husband's last words through 3 territories and the unforgiving spine of the American frontier, and she did not even know his name until 30 seconds ago. "Why?" she whispered, and the question held more inside it than she had words for. Why had Matthew written to her if he was already supposed to be dead? Why had a stranger carried this letter across half the continent? What kind of betrayal was folded inside that envelope? And what kind of secret had Matthew Ford taken with him to wherever he had finally gone? Oscar Holloway looked at her with those river-dark eyes, and she saw something in them that she had not expected to see in a stranger's face. She saw a man who had been carrying something heavier than paper for a very long time. "Because he told me what was in it," Oscar said quietly, "and I decided someone ought to know the truth." The wind picked up. A loose board on the south corner of the barn knocked against its frame. Somewhere down the road toward town, a crow called out once and went silent. Hester Ford pressed the letter against her chest and tried to remember how to breathe. That morning had started like every other morning since Matthew's supposed death. She had risen before the sun because the cow needed milking and Lily needed feeding, and the stove needed wood, and the world did not pause its demands simply because a woman was drowning in grief and uncertainty and the particular loneliness of the frontier. Hester had come to the Oklahoma territory 4 years ago as a bride, following Matthew Ford's dream of land and cattle, and a life built by their own hands. She had been 23 then, young and fierce, and full of a courage she mistook for optimism. Matthew was 6 years her senior, a man with a salesman's charm and a gambler's restlessness that she had not fully understood when she married him in St. Louis in the spring of 1882. He had been handsome and magnetic, and he had made her feel like the most important woman in any room he walked into. And she had loved him with the full and unguarded heart of a woman who had not yet learned that love alone cannot reveal a person's whole truth. They had settled on 40 acres outside the town of Millhaven in the Oklahoma territory in the summer of that same year. The house Matthew built was small but solid. The cattle herd was modest but growing. Lily was born in the winter of 1883, a fierce and healthy girl who screamed her way into the world as though she intended to fight it from the first moment, and Hester had thought, holding her daughter for the first time, that perhaps this was enough. Perhaps this was everything. Then Matthew had started disappearing. Not for long at first. A day here, 2 days there, business in town, he said, cattle negotiations, men he needed to meet. Hester had learned not to ask too many questions because the answers Matthew gave never quite matched the questions she had asked, and she had grown tired of the particular frustration of speaking to someone who only ever gave you the shape of the truth without the substance of it. In the spring of 1884, Matthew had ridden out toward Abilene and not come back. The sheriff had come to her door 3 weeks later with a telegram from the Kansas authorities. Matthew Ford had been killed in a dispute outside a saloon in Abilene. He had been identified by the contents of his pockets. She should collect whatever funds she could and make arrangements for herself and the child. Hester had stood in her doorway reading that telegram while Lily slept inside, and she had felt something strange happening inside her chest. Grief, certainly, but beneath the grief something else, something that felt almost like confirmation. She had gotten through the following months by sheer stubbornness. The neighbors, what few there were in that sparse stretch of Oklahoma land, had helped when they could. She had taken in washing, sold eggs, and refused to sell the land despite the pressure from a man named Calhoun Briggs, who ran the bank in Millhaven, and seemed to believe that a widow with a child had no business holding onto property without a man to manage it. She had been surviving, not thriving, not happy in any full sense of the word, but surviving. And that had felt like enough until this September morning when a stranger rode up her dirt road on a bay horse that had clearly been ridden very hard and very far, and everything she thought she knew about her own life lurched sideways. She led Oscar Holloway inside because there was nothing else to do. The frontier code that had governed these lands since before the railroads required that a traveler be offered water and food if you had them. And Hester had a pot of beans on the stove and a well that had not gone dry yet. She poured him a tin cup of water and watched him drink it without rushing, with the controlled gratitude of a man who had gone without enough times to know better than to take anything for granted. Lily came out from the back room and studied the stranger with the frank and fearless curiosity of a child who had learned to size up people quickly. She was 2 years old in December, small for her age but bright-eyed and alert, with her father's dark hair and Hester's stubborn chin. "Man," Lily announced, pointing at Oscar. "That is right," Hester said. "This is Mr. Holloway. He has come a long way." Oscar looked at the child and something shifted in his expression. Not sentiment exactly, but a kind of careful recognition, as though Lily's existence made the weight of the letter he had been carrying more concrete than it had ever felt across all those miles. "She is a fine little girl," he said. "She is," Hester agreed, and she meant it as both statement and warning. She set the letter on the table between them while she ladled beans into bowls. She had not opened it yet. Some part of her was afraid to, and she was not a woman who frightened easily. She had faced down a prairie storm with nothing but a root cellar and a prayer. She had delivered her own child when the midwife could not reach them through the December mud. She had kept 40 acres of Oklahoma land from a greedy banker through 2 full seasons of drought and threat. But the sight of Matthew's handwriting on that envelope made her hands uncertain in a way that nothing else had. Oscar ate without speaking for a while. He ate carefully, with the measured attention of someone accustomed to not knowing where the next meal might come from. When he finished, he set down his spoon and looked across the table at her. "You do not have to open it tonight," he said. "You have carried it 4 months," she said. "The least I can do is read it." "Take your time," he said. "I am not going anywhere tonight unless you send me away." Something about the way he said it struck her. Not the words exactly, but the tone, steady, patient, as though he genuinely had nowhere else to be and no urgency that superseded her own pace. She opened the letter. Matthew Ford had not been a poetic man. His words on paper were the same as his words in conversation, surface smooth, practical, built to accomplish a specific task rather than to reveal anything deep. But this letter was different. Hester could tell from the first line that something had broken open in him when he wrote it, that whatever circumstances had produced this document had stripped away the salesman's gloss and left something rawer beneath. The letter said that he was sorry. It said that he had made terrible decisions, the nature of which he did not fully spell out but which Hester was meant to understand from the phrase. The money from Calhoun Briggs was not a loan. It said that there were men who wanted him dead because of what he knew about those transactions, and that those men had connections in the Oklahoma Territory and specifically in Millhaven, and that Hester and Lily were not safe as long as Briggs knew they were on that land. It said that he had loved her in the broken and insufficient way that was all he had ever been capable of, and that he was sorry it had not been enough. And then near the end, in a handwriting that had grown visibly less controlled, it said that the man carrying this letter was the only man Matthew Ford had trusted in the last year of his life, and that if Oscar Holloway was standing in her kitchen when she read this, then Hester should know that Oscar was a man worth trusting. He asked her to trust him. He used the word please. Hester set the letter down. Her face was very still. Across the table, Oscar Holloway was watching her with those quiet eyes. "You knew what this said," she told him. "He read it to me before he sealed it. He wanted me to know what I was carrying so I could make an informed decision about whether to carry it." "And you decided yes." "I decided yes." "Why?" she asked again, and this time the question was entirely about him. Oscar was quiet for a moment. He turned his tin cup slowly on the table, a thoughtful gesture without restlessness in it. "Because he was dying when he asked me. Not from a bullet, not yet. From something inside him, something that had been eating at him a long time. And he was not asking me for himself. He was asking for you and for that child." He glanced toward the back room where Lily had retreated with a rag doll. "A man can walk past a lot of things in this life. I have walked past more than my share, but I could not walk past that." Hester studied him. He was perhaps 28 or 29, lean in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors, with hands that showed both hard labor and careful control. There were no obvious weapons on him that she could see, though she had noticed the worn holster when he first dismounted, currently empty, the pistol tucked into his saddlebag as a deliberate courtesy. That gesture had registered with her even in the shock of the letter's arrival. "The part about Calhoun Briggs," she said. "What do you know about it?" "Enough," Oscar said. "Briggs ran a land scheme out of Abilene for a few years. He would have local men acquire land on his behalf through debt arrangements, men like your husband who needed money and did not read contracts carefully. When those men became inconvenient, they had accidents. Your husband figured out what the arrangement really meant when a friend of his had a fatal accident in the spring of last year. He ran. He ran all the way to Laramie before they caught up with him. The cold that moved through Hester then had nothing to do with the September air. "He is dead," she said. "Matthew." "Yes," Oscar said, and the simplicity of it confirmed what the telegram had almost said, but not quite. "He died in Laramie, not Abilene." The men who reported his death to the Kansas authorities worked for Briggs. They moved the location to keep the investigation away from Wyoming. "And Briggs is still in Millhaven," Oscar said, "still running the bank, still putting pressure on anyone who holds land in this territory." Hester stood up and walked to the window. The sky outside had gone the deep blue of early evening, and the first stars were beginning to press through. The barn stood dark against the last light, and the 40 acres spread out behind it, familiar and hard-won, and suddenly more dangerous than she had understood. She had thought Briggs was simply an aggressive businessman, that his interest in her land was opportunistic rather than personal. She had thought the worst she faced was economic pressure, foreclosure, the ordinary cruelties of a system that did not favor widows. She had not known that the arrangement that made her a widow in the first place had originated with that man, or that her continued presence on this land represented something to him beyond a simple real estate transaction. The letter had said she was not safe. Oscar Holloway, a man she had known for less than 2 hours, had traveled 4 months to deliver that information to her. She turned back from the window. "Where are you going next?" He met her eyes. "Nowhere that matters. I have no fixed destination." "A drifter," she said. "Some would call it that." "What would you call it?" He thought about that for a moment with a seriousness that she found unexpectedly compelling. "A man between certainties," he said at last. "I know what I came from. I have not yet figured out what I am going toward." She sat back down. Lily had appeared in the doorway again. rag doll under her arm, studying Oscar with an expression that in a child her age signified either approval or deep suspicion, and Hester had learned to pay attention to which one it was. Lily walked across the room, climbed up onto the chair beside Oscar and placed her rag doll on the table in front of him as though offering an official certification. Oscar looked at the rag doll. He looked at Lily. The corner of his mouth moved. "Her name is Pear," Lily informed him. "That is a good name," Oscar said seriously. Lily nodded. "You can look at her, but she sleeps with me." "Understood," he said. Hester watched this exchange and felt something shift in her chest. Not love, not yet. Not anything so defined and organized as that. But the particular awareness that comes when a person reveals something true about themselves in an unguarded moment, and what is revealed is good. She fed Oscar supper properly that evening, not just the beans but the cornbread she had been saving, and the last of the summer preserves. He helped her clear the table without being asked, moving in her small kitchen with a careful respect for her space that she noticed and catalogued without comment. He asked about the land, genuinely asked, with the questions of someone trying to understand rather than to appraise, and she told him about the cattle, the well, the problem with the south fence that she had been meaning to repair since spring. When Lily was put to bed and the lamp was turned low, they sat on the porch in the cooling air and Hester asked him where he had come from, before the drift. He told her about Missouri, a farm near Joplin, a family that had been broken apart by the war before he was old enough to understand what was happening, a childhood spent moving between various relatives' households with the particular rootlessness of a child who knows he is a burden even when he is treated kindly. He had come west at 19 with the cattle drives and had spent the following decade learning the land, doing honest work when he could find it and staying hungry when he could not, building nothing permanent because the idea of permanence had always felt like something that belonged to other people. He told this without self-pity. That was what struck her. There was no performance in his story, no bid for sympathy. He simply described his life the way you might describe the weather, observable, factual, nothing to be done about what had already passed. You trusted a dying stranger enough to carry his letter 4 months across the frontier, Hester said. That says something about you. It says I had nothing better to do, he said, but the slight shift in his expression told her that was not the full truth, and they both knew it. It says you are a man who keeps promises, she said. He was quiet after that, looking out at the dark land. The night insects were singing in the long grass. A coyote called somewhere far off to the south. Your husband told me you were the most capable woman he had ever met, Oscar said at last. He said that the worst part of what he had done was that you deserved better. He was crying when he said it. I do not tell you that to hurt you. I tell you because I think you should know that he knew. The grief that moved through Hester was not the sharp and shattering kind. It was the slower, quieter grief of a love that had been flawed from the beginning, full of holes and hidden chambers, but had existed nonetheless in its broken way. She had loved Matthew Ford. She had also spent 4 years quietly grieving the marriage she had believed she was entering when she had in fact entered something else entirely. Both things were true. Thank you, she said, and she meant it for all of it. The letter, the journey, the information about Briggs and this last small and genuine thing. He nodded once. Then he went asleep in the barn, because she had offered the barn and he had accepted it without protest or theater, with the same quiet practicality with which he seemed to approach everything. Hester lay awake for a long time listening to the wind and thinking about danger and letters and strangers who turned out to be exactly what they appeared to be. In the morning, Oscar was up before her. When she came out to start the stove, she found him in the yard splitting the woodpile she had been struggling with for 2 weeks. He worked steadily, without showing off, pausing when he saw her to say good morning with a directness that was neither forward nor distant. She made coffee. He came in when the woodpile was finished and stacked neatly under the porch overhang, and she handed him a cup and watched him hold it with both hands in the morning chill. I need to think about what to do, she told him. About Briggs. Yes, he agreed. I cannot leave this land. It is the only thing I have. I understand that. But if what the letter says is true, if he arranged Matthew's death to protect himself, then staying here and doing nothing is not safe either. Also true. She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. You know this territory better than I do. You have been moving through it for months. I know it reasonably well, he said carefully. What would you do in my position? He considered this with the same seriousness he brought to everything. I would not confront Briggs directly, not without documentation of what he did. Words against a banker's words in this territory go in the banker's favor every time. He paused. But I know a man, a territorial marshal named Aiken, based out of Guthrie. He has been watching Briggs for some time. If you could get documentation, the original land contract between your husband and Briggs, any correspondence, that would be a different matter. Matthew's papers, she said slowly. He kept papers in a lockbox. He took it with him when he left in the spring. I assumed it was lost. He gave me a key before he died, Oscar said. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a small iron key on a leather cord. He set it on the table between them. He said the box was in Laramie, at a boarding house on the north end of town, held by a woman named Aldridge who was a friend of his. He asked me to get it once I had delivered the letter. Hester stared at the key. The shape of it was entirely ordinary, the iron worn smooth with handling, but she felt the weight of what it represented as though it had its own gravity. Laramie is in Wyoming, she said. About 400 miles, he confirmed. The practical mathematics of it settled over her. She had Lily to consider. She had 40 acres she could not simply abandon. She had a neighbor woman, Agnes Polk, who was trustworthy and who had offered before to watch Lily when the need arose. But Agnes had her own family and her own burdens and could not be asked to assume an open-ended obligation. And she had a letter from a dead man and a stranger with road-quiet eyes who had traveled 4 months on nothing more than a promise. Tell me about yourself, she said. Not the history. The present, who are you? He met her gaze. I am a man who has spent 10 years learning that the open road is not as free as it looks. I am a man who is tired of moving and has not yet found a reason to stop. He paused. Until possibly this week. The honesty of it landed in her chest like a stone in still water, sending ripples outward in all directions. She looked away first. She was not ready for that, not with the letter still fresh and Matthew's ghost still moving through every corner of this house. But she filed it away with the same careful attention she had given to the empty holster, and the way he had spoken to Lily about the rag doll. And she thought about what it meant that a man could travel 4 months to deliver a letter, and still have the character to say something that direct without pushing for anything in return. She spoke to Agnes Polk that afternoon. Agnes was a stout, sensible woman in her mid-30s, with 3 children of her own and a husband who worked the land 2 miles east. She agreed to take Lily for a week, perhaps 2, and she asked Hester plainly if there was trouble coming, and Hester told her yes, potentially, and Agnes said that Hester should take care of herself, and that Lily would eat plenty and be fine. The harder part was the land itself. She could not leave it unattended for the weeks a round trip to Laramie would require. The cattle needed water and watching. The south fence needed repair to keep them contained. She thought about this for the rest of that day while Oscar repaired the fence post he had noticed on his walk around the property, doing it without being asked, doing it correctly, using the tools from the shed with the ease of a man who knew his way around a farm. She made her decision over supper. I am coming with you to Laramie, she told him. He did not look surprised. The child will stay with Agnes Polk. She is a good woman. The land. I will speak to a man named Harrison who runs a small ranch to the north. He owes me a favor. He will check on the cattle. Oscar turned his fork over on his plate. It is a hard journey, 400 miles, mostly open country. October will bring weather. I know, she said. I have lived here 4 years. I know what October looks like. It would be faster on horseback than by wagon. I have a horse and I can ride. He looked at her for a long moment. There was assessment in his gaze, the honest evaluation of a practical man considering whether this plan made sense, and she met it without flinching because she was not in the habit of flinching. "All right," he said. "We leave day after tomorrow." "That gives us time to make proper arrangements." She nodded. Then she said, "I am trusting you, Oscar Holloway." "I know," he said. "I do not take that lightly." They left on a Tuesday morning in the first week of October 1886, heading north through the Oklahoma Territory toward the Kansas border. Hester rode her dark mare, a horse she called Juniper, steady and strong and well known to her. Oscar rode his bay, which he had named nothing as far as she could tell, calling it only Horse in a tone of affectionate pragmatism. The first day was hard going, as first days always were, and they spoke little, learning each other's traveling rhythm. Oscar set a pace that was firm but not punishing, and he checked on her condition without making it feel like surveillance. When they stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat, he produced dried beef and hard biscuits from his saddlebag and divided them equally without comment. "Where did you learn to travel like this?" she asked. "You move through open country like it is ordinary." "Cattle drives out of Texas mainly," he said. "Then some work with survey crews, then a long stretch with a freighting outfit out of Denver. I have crossed this country in most directions at least once." "You have done a lot of things." "None of them for very long," he said, and there was something rueful in it. "What did you want to do?" she asked, "when you were young and could still imagine choosing?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I wanted a farm, land of my own, something I could tend and watch grow." He picked up a stone from the ground and turned it in his fingers. "It seemed like a thing that happened to other people." "It can happen to anyone," she said. "You just have to stay somewhere long enough." His eyes met hers and held for a moment, and the silence between them carried something that neither of them was ready to name. They camped that night by a creek in southern Kansas. The temperature dropped sharply after dark, and Hester's bedroll, adequate for the milder Oklahoma nights she was accustomed to, proved insufficient. She did not say anything about it, but Oscar noticed. She saw him notice. And he built the fire up higher than strictly necessary and positioned their bedrolls closer together on the windward side of it without making anything of it. She woke twice in the night. Both times the fire was still burning. The second day took them deeper into Kansas. The land was wide and spare, great rolling distances that reminded Hester of why people either loved the West or were crushed by it. There was no ambiguity here, no shelter from the size of things. The sky pressed down huge and blue, and the horizon went on forever in every direction. They talked more on the second day. She told him about St. Louis, where she had grown up, the daughter of a dry goods merchant who had died when she was 18, leaving her and her younger sister Clara to manage on their own. She told him about the boarding house where she had worked and then managed for 3 years before Matthew Ford had walked in and changed the entire direction of her life. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Coming west?" "I regret some of the circumstances," she said carefully. "Not the land, not Lily, not the woman I became out here." She looked at the horizon. "The city was comfortable, but it was never mine. This is harder, but it is mine in a way the city never was." He understood that. She could see it in his face, the recognition of a person who has also learned something essential from hardship rather than comfort. They entered Colorado on the third day, and the landscape shifted around them, the flat Kansas plains giving way to a more rolling terrain with the distant blue promise of the Rockies showing on the western horizon. The light was different here, sharper and cleaner, and the air tasted of altitude and approaching winter. They passed through a small town called Buckner on the fourth day to resupply. The general store was run by a man who clearly wanted to ask questions about why a woman and a man with clearly different last names were traveling together, and Hester watched Oscar handle this with a fluid and unflappable courtesy that answered nothing while closing down the inquiry entirely. He bought supplies and a heavier blanket without being asked, tucking it behind his saddle with no comment, and Hester understood it was for her. She did not thank him immediately. She waited until they were back out on the road, and then she said, "The blanket. Cold snap coming, he said, looking at the sky. You did not have to. I know, he said. She looked at the side of his face. The healing cut on his jaw had faded to a thin line. He had a clean profile, strong bone but not harsh, and there was something in the set of his mouth that suggested a man who had swallowed a great many things without complaint. How did you meet Matthew? She asked. The question had been waiting several days. Oscar was quiet a moment. In a saloon in Laramie. He was drunk and he was being cheated at cards by two men who were not subtle about it, and I told the men to stop. They objected. I objected more effectively. He said this without pride, simply as description. Matthew bought me a drink after. We talked for a few hours. He was not a bad man, your husband. He was a weak man who had made choices that got ahead of him. That is a different thing. I know, she said quietly. He talked about you, Oscar continued. Both times we spoke, which was that night and then 2 days later when he was dying. He talked about you more than anything else. He said he had never deserved you and he knew it, but he had not known how to be different. That is both the kindest and the most frustrating thing anyone has ever told me about him, Hester said. Probably accurate, though. Probably, she agreed. She felt tears at the corners of her eyes, surprising and unwelcome, and she blinked them back without drama. He was not cruel, Matthew. I want to be fair to him. He was not cruel. He was just absent in some fundamental way that I could not reach him. Some people are, Oscar said gently. You are not, she said, and then she surprised herself by saying it because she had not planned to. He looked at her. The horses walked on at their steady pace. No, he said at last. I am not. The cold snap arrived that night, exactly as he had predicted, dropping the temperature below freezing while they were still 2 days out from Laramie. They sheltered in a shallow ravine, with the horses picketed close for shared warmth, and the fire was a small and precious thing in the enormous dark. Hester used the blanket from Buckner and still woke at 3 in the morning with her feet numb. She found Oscar sitting up on watch, which she had not asked him to do and which he had clearly decided on his own. You should sleep, she said. I sleep lightly, he said, and I have spent more nights outdoors than indoors in the last decade. This is not hardship for me. She moved to sit beside him by the fire. He shifted to give her the warmest angle without making a ceremony of it, a gesture so natural and instinctive that it might not have been a gesture at all, and she sat close enough to be warm and he did not move away. Are you afraid? He asked. About Briggs? Yes, she said honestly. He is not a man who tolerates loose ends. If what Matthew wrote is true, then knowing what I know makes me a loose end. We will get the documents, Oscar said, and the word "we" landed in the air between them with a quiet solidity. Then we take them to Marshal Aiken in Guthrie. Briggs is not untouchable. He has just been operating in a place where no one with the authority to stop him has had enough documentation. And if the box is not there? If this woman Aldridge has moved or the box is gone? We deal with that when we face it, he said simply. Right now we are 2 days from Laramie and the box is most likely there. She turned her head and looked at his face in the firelight. He was watching the dark beyond the fire with a calm steadiness that she found. She realized, deeply and specifically reassuring. Not because he was making guarantees or performing confidence, but because his calm was clearly not a performance. It was the real condition of a man who had faced enough genuine danger to know the difference between what was worth worrying about and what was not. Tell me something good, she said. Not about any of this. Something good you have seen out here on all your traveling. He thought for a moment. I was in New Mexico territory 3 years ago, working with a survey crew near the White Mountains. We were camped on the edge of a mesa, and one morning before sunrise I woke up and went to the edge of the mesa, and the whole valley below was filled with clouds, just filled like a white sea. And we were above the clouds in the sun, and everything below was still dark and sleeping. I stood there for half an hour watching the clouds move. She listened. Did the others see it? I woke one man. He looked at it for about 30 seconds and said it was cold and went back to sleep. She laughed. The sound of it surprised her a little, genuine and unbidden. He turned to look at her when she laughed, and the expression on his face was something she felt in her chest. "I would have watched it with you," she said. "I know," he said. "I think I knew that before I met you somehow, from what Matthew said." She was quiet for a while, thinking about that, about a dying man speaking about her to a stranger, about what he had said and what it had made Oscar decide. "Why did it matter?" she asked. "Truly. Why did you decide to carry the letter?" He was honest with her, the way she was learning he was always honest when he had a moment to think. "Because he described you as someone who was living inside a lie that was not of your making. Someone who deserved to know the truth, even if the truth was painful. And I have spent my whole life watching people go without information they needed, because no one thought it was their responsibility to deliver it." He paused. "I thought it was mine." Hester Ford sat by that fire in the cold Colorado night and felt something unlock inside her that had been closed for a very long time. Laramie in October was a working town, practical and purposeful, with a main street of wooden storefronts and a rail depot that connected it to the wider world. They rode in on a Saturday morning, road-worn and trail-silent, and Hester was aware of the picture they presented. A man and a woman traveling alone together, no obvious family relation, arriving from the south on tired horses with trail packs. She kept her chin level and her eyes forward. The boarding house on the north end was a modest two-story structure run by a woman named Eleanor Aldridge, who opened the door to Oscar's knock and looked at him for a long, quiet moment with the eyes of someone measuring the distance between expectation and reality. "He said someone would come," she said. "I did not know if they would." "I came," Oscar said. "And this is Mrs. Ford, Matthew's wife." Eleanor Aldridge transferred her gaze to Hester and held it there a long time. She was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair and capable hands and an expression that had learned to withhold judgment without withholding feeling. "He spoke of you," Eleanor said to Hester. "He stayed here 3 months before the end. I knew him." There was something in how she said it that Hester registered, not romantically, not possessively, but with the deep care of a woman who had watched a person suffer and tried to ease it. "Thank you," Hester said, "for keeping what he left here." Eleanor brought them inside and sat them down and brought out coffee before she went upstairs. When she came back, she was carrying a wooden lockbox, battered with travel and sealed with an iron lock, and she set it on the table in front of Hester. Hester brought out the key. The iron was still bright in the lock, the mechanism kept oiled by someone's careful attention, and when she turned the key, the box opened cleanly. What was inside was a carefully ordered archive of a man's guilt. Contracts, yes. The land arrangement with Briggs, handwritten and signed, with terms that would have been obviously coercive to anyone with legal knowledge, but which Matthew had perhaps been too desperate or too trusting to properly read. Correspondence between Briggs and another man in Abilene, whose name Hester did not recognize. A record of payments made and received over 18 months. And at the bottom, a folded document that appeared to be an account in Matthew's own handwriting of what he understood had happened to the man, whose accident had made him run names, dates, circumstances. Oscar picked up the contracts and looked at them with the eyes of a man who had spent enough time in frontier courts to understand what he was reading. "This is enough," he said. "This is more than enough for Marshal Aiken." Hester held the papers and thought about the shape of hidden lives, about the things people carried that no one else could see. She thought about Matthew writing these documents down, preserving them, perhaps hoping that they might eventually serve a purpose beyond his own survival. "He was trying to make it right," she said quietly, "at the end." "Yes," Oscar agreed. "He was." Eleanor Aldridge gave them rooms for 2 nights. Separate rooms because Hester asked for it that way and Oscar accepted it without question. But they sat up late both evenings in the small parlor of the boarding house, talking in a way that had evolved past necessity into something else, something that was its own reason. He told her about a winter in Wyoming when he was 22 and had nearly died of cold in the open country, and how it had changed his relationship with his own survival from passive to active. She told him about the night Lily was born, how she had managed alone, and what she had felt when she first held her daughter in the lamplight. He said, "You are the most remarkable person I have met in 10 years of meeting people." She said, "I am an ordinary woman in difficult circumstances." He said, "Those are not contradictions." She looked at him across the parlor table and thought about what it meant that she trusted him. Not in the general, abstract way of trusting someone's intentions, but in the specific bodily way of trusting someone's presence, the kind of trust that made a person feel safer asleep than awake, that made the darkness less dark and the cold less cold. She had not felt that with Matthew. She was honest enough to admit it now, here in this parlor, this close to the place where Matthew had ended. She had respected Matthew. She had wanted to love him as fully as she was capable of loving. But she had never trusted him, the way she trusted this man she had known 8 days. On the second evening in Laramie, after Alina had gone to bed and the parlor was very quiet, Oscar reached across the table and put his hand over hers. It was not a claiming gesture. It was a question. She felt the difference. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a long time in the lamplight, with the Laramie wind outside and the future neither of them had yet fully imagined lying between them like an unfolded map. "When this is finished," she said carefully. "When the documents are with the marshal and Briggs is dealt with and Lily is home and the land is safe." She paused. "What do you want?" His hand was warm and steady around hers. "I want to stop moving," he said. "I want to find out what it feels like to stay." "Stay where?" He looked at her directly. "I think you know." Her heart was doing something complicated and breathless. "I have a small house," she said, "and a south fence that keeps needing repair, and a 2-year-old who will definitely try to give you her rag doll." "Those all sound like things I could work with," he said. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back, and they left it there for that night, which was enough. They rode south out of Laramie on Monday morning, with the lockbox tied securely behind Oscar's saddle. The sky was the clear, hard blue of an October that had turned its mind to winter, and the air was cold and brilliant. Hester felt different than she had riding north. The weight of the unknown had lifted enough to let in something lighter. They made better time going south. The horses were rested and the terrain was familiar now, and there was an ease between Hester and Oscar that had not been there before, the ease of people who have told each other true things and found they were still standing after. They talked about practical things, how the documents should be organized before presenting them to Marshal Aiken. What might happen to the land if Briggs attempted legal action before the marshal could move? Oscar had been to Guthrie once and knew the territory capital somewhat, and he described it for her as they rode. He also talked about farming, about what crops he had seen grow well in the Oklahoma territory, about cattle management and water rights and the particular challenges of the region's weather patterns. He spoke from genuine knowledge, and she listened with genuine interest, and it occurred to her somewhere in the middle of Kansas that they were talking about her land as though it were their land, and neither of them had flagged the change. She let it stand. On the third day back south, they hit bad weather. Not a blizzard, but a sustained, driving cold rain that turned the trail to mud and lowered visibility to 50 yards. They pushed through it for 3 hours before Oscar said, without drama, that they needed to stop. They found a homesteader's abandoned cabin a 1/4 mile off the trail, still solid despite its vacancy. The roof had 2 holes in it, but the corners were dry, and there was a small stove and a rusted but functional grate, and enough scavenged wood in what had been a wood pile to make a fire. They worked together without speaking much, seeing to the horses first and then to the fire, falling into a shared efficiency that felt, Hester thought, like nothing so much as habit, as though they had done this before, as though there was muscle memory in the cooperation. When the fire was going and they were both damp and cold and warming slowly, Oscar looked over at her from across the stove. "You are all right," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Better than all right," he said, and his expression was so unguarded and so quietly joyful in the firelight that she crossed the distance between them and kissed him. It was not a careful, measured kiss. It was a true one. The kind that happens when two people have been honest enough with each other that there is no longer any useful pretense left. He kissed her back with the same quality of honesty, his hands at her face with a gentleness that made her understand something she had not understood before about the difference between being handled and being held. When they broke apart, they were both very still. "Hester," he said. Her name in his voice was something she thought she could listen to for the rest of her life. "Oscar," she said back, which was perhaps not a complete sentence but was entirely accurate. He pressed his forehead against hers for a moment, and she closed her eyes, and the rain drove against the cabin walls, and the fire snapped, and the horses shifted in the lean-to outside, and she thought, here. This is here. This is now. They rode into Millhaven on a Saturday evening in mid-October to find the town in the active middle of some kind of public disturbance. There was a crowd outside the bank, and a man on a horse in front of it who Hester recognized with a cold shock as Deputy Carver, Briggs's particular instrument in most things. Oscar read the scene the same moment she did. He moved his horse to block her line of sight from the crowd and spoke quietly without turning his head. "Keep moving toward Agnes Polk's. Get Lily and go to her house. I will handle this." "You will not handle this alone," she said. "Hester, I will not argue with you in the middle of the street," she said very evenly. "But I am not going to hide at Agnes Polk's house while you ride into trouble on my behalf. That is not how this works." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was half frustration and half something that looked remarkably like admiration. Then he said, "All right, but stay behind me and say nothing until we understand the situation." They rode closer. The crowd was made up of perhaps 20 townspeople, and the argument at its center appeared to be between Deputy Carver and a man Hester recognized as Harrison, the rancher from the north who was watching her cattle. Harrison's face was red and his voice was carrying. "You have no authority to impound that land," Harrison was saying. "There has been no court order. There has been no process." "Mr. Briggs is owed a debt," Carver said, with the bored authority of a man who has been told to say something and does not particularly care whether it is true. "Until the debt is settled, the land is security." "The woman has been gone less than 2 weeks," Harrison said. "This is a seizure, not a collection. There is a difference." Hester pulled Juniper to a halt at the edge of the crowd and sat very straight in the saddle. Her voice came out clean and carrying. "That land is not available for seizure," she said, "and any attempt to take it will be contested by documented evidence of fraud already in the hands of the territorial authorities." The crowd turned. Carver's head swiveled toward her and she saw the quick calculation in his eyes, the brief assessment of whether she was bluffing and the recognition that she might not be. Oscar was beside her, very still, very present. He had the particular stillness of a man who knows how to wait. "Mrs. Ford," Carver said, recovering his composure, "you have been absent. Mr. Briggs has concerns about the security of his financial interest. Mr. Briggs has concerns about a federal warrant," she said, because it was the right thing to say, and she said it before she fully decided to, and she watched the effect of it move through the crowd. "I have spent the last 2 weeks in Wyoming. I have documentation of Mr. Briggs's arrangement with my late husband. That documentation is now in the hands of a territorial marshal. Any move against my land will be seen as intimidation of a federal witness." She had no idea if the term federal witness was technically correct. She suspected it was not. But it was the right kind of language for this moment, and she could see Carver trying to decide whether she was accurate and finding himself unable to be certain. "You should speak to Mr. Briggs," Carver said, with significantly less confidence. "I will speak to Mr. Briggs when I am ready to," she said, "through the appropriate legal channels. Good evening, Deputy." She walked Juniper forward through the edge of the crowd with Oscar at her side, and she did not look back, because the one thing you absolutely could not do in that kind of moment was look back. They went straight to Agnes Polk's house. Agnes came out when she heard the horses and had Lily in her arms before Hester had dismounted, and Lily threw herself at her mother with the force of a small and determined cannonball. "Mama," Lily said firmly, which was both greeting and reprimand. "I know, sweetheart," Hester said into her daughter's hair, holding her tight and breathing her in. "I know." Agnes Polk looked at Oscar and then at Hester and said nothing, which was one of the things Hester valued most about Agnes. They stayed at Agnes's that night. The following morning, Hester rode into Millhaven and sent a telegram to Marshal Aiken in Guthrie, detailing the documents she had and describing the attempted land seizure of the previous evening. She sent a second telegram to a lawyer in Oklahoma City whom the territorial newspaper had mentioned in connection with a successful fraud case the previous year. The response from Guthrie came within 24 hours. Marshal Aiken was already aware of Briggs. He had been watching but lacked the specific documentation necessary for a formal charge. Hester's documents, combined with the testimony of others in the territory whom Aiken had been quietly gathering, would be sufficient. He would arrive in Millhaven within 10 days. Those 10 days were tense and watchful. Oscar stayed. He stayed without being asked and without making anything of it, taking up residence in the barn and spending his days repairing the south fence and managing the cattle and doing the 100 physical tasks a working farm required of its occupants. He and Hester worked side by side through those days, and the rhythm of shared work built between them, a kind of intimacy that was different from the intimacy of the road but equally real. Lily, who trusted very few people on first meeting, had decided within 24 hours of Oscar's return that he was approved. She followed him with the devotion of a small and opinionated supervisor, offering commentary on his fence repair technique and presenting Pear the rag doll for inspection each morning. Oscar accepted all of this with a gravity that made both Hester and Lily happy for different reasons. Briggs made one more move before Aiken arrived. He sent a man to the farm on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, a stranger Hester did not recognize, with a paper that purported to be a legal notice of debt collection. Oscar was at the south fence when the man arrived, and Hester came out onto the porch alone. She looked at the paper. She looked at the man. "You will tell Mr. Briggs," she said, in a voice she had been practicing her entire life without knowing it, "that I have nothing to say to him except through a court of law." The man looked past her toward the barn, where Oscar was now visible in the doorway. The man left. He did not come back. Marshal Aiken arrived on a Wednesday morning with 2 deputies and a warrant. He was a tall, gray-eyed man in his 40s, who moved with the unhurried authority of someone who had spent 20 years, making the frontier accountable to a law that it sometimes tried to forget existed. He sat at Hester's kitchen table and went through the documents with the focused attention of a professional, asking clarifying questions in a quiet and methodical voice. Oscar sat at the table too, because Aiken had asked specifically to speak with the man who had retrieved the documents from Laramie and who had been present at Matthew Ford's death. He answered every question directly and without embellishment. When Aiken was finished, he put the documents in his case and looked at Hester. "Mrs. Ford," he said, "I want to be honest with you. Briggs will almost certainly face federal charges. The land contract with your husband was one of at least 4 similar arrangements I can document. The fraud is established. The connection to the death of the man your husband witnessed, that will take more work to prosecute, but we have more than we had yesterday." He paused. "Your land is not at risk. Any claims against it are without legal foundation." Hester felt the knot that had been in her chest since September begin slowly to loosen. "Thank you," she said. "Calhoun Briggs was arrested that afternoon." Hester did not go to watch it because she did not need to. She was standing in her own yard in the October sunshine, with Lily on her hip and the south fence repaired, and the cattle accounted for and 40 acres of Oklahoma land solid beneath her feet, and that was sufficient. Oscar came to stand beside her. He had his hat off and the sun was in his hair, and he looked, for the first time since she had met him, like a man who was not moving, like a man who had arrived. "It is done," he said. "Most of it," she agreed. He looked at her. "Not all of it." She turned to face him. You said in Laramie that you wanted to stop moving. I did, he confirmed. And you said you thought you knew where. I did, he said again, and his eyes were very direct. I am not going to be delicate about this, she said. I have not been a delicate woman since approximately the year I turned 25 and stopped pretending that things would work out on their own without someone doing something about them. She shifted Lily on her hip. Lily reached across and put her hand on Oscar's arm with perfect timing, as though providing documentation. I love this land. I am going to keep it. I am going to build something on it that lasts. And I think you are the kind of man who could be part of that if you chose to be. I think we are the kind of people who would be good together. I think you know that as well as I do. Oscar looked at her for a long moment. The corner of his mouth moved. Are you asking me to stay? He said, I am telling you that you are welcome to stay, she said. The asking is yours. He took the 2 steps between them and kissed her once, firmly and with intention, with Lily watching between them with great interest. I am asking, he said against her mouth. I am absolutely asking. Good, she said, and she kissed him back. The winter of 1886 came down hard and early, as Oklahoma winters sometimes did, and the farm became the kind of place that defined itself through the work of keeping it. Oscar was not a man who needed to be told what needed doing. He saw it and he did it, with the careful competence of someone who had spent a decade learning how to manage an open country, and was now applying that knowledge to something permanent. The first time the stove pipe froze and had to be cleared at 3 in the morning, Oscar and Hester did it together in the dark, their breath visible in the lamplight, and afterward they stood in the kitchen while the stove rebuilt its heat and drank hot coffee and laughed at themselves a little, and Hester thought that this was what she had been missing without knowing it. Not help, exactly, though help was not nothing. But this, the specific ease of managing hard things alongside someone who met them with the same steady quality she tried to bring herself. She wrote to her sister Clara in St. Louis in December, a long letter that told most of the true story of the preceding months. Clara, who had always had good instincts, wrote back immediately. Her letter said 2 things worth noting. First, that she was glad the situation with Briggs had been resolved, and second, that she wanted to meet Oscar Holloway and that Hester had better not let him go anywhere before she did. Hester read that letter aloud to Oscar over supper, and he listened with an expression of careful pleasure. She sounds formidable, he said. She is, Hester confirmed. You will like her. I think I probably will, he agreed, and the certainty in his voice implied a future that stretched out long enough to contain Clara's visit, and she did not try to contain the happiness that produced. Lily, through that winter, continued her ongoing project of attaching herself to Oscar with the determination of a small person who has decided something and sees no reason to be subtle about it. She insisted on sitting beside him at meals. She brought Pear to him for consultation on important matters. She asked him to read to her in the evenings, which he did, slowly and carefully, with the slight self-consciousness of a man whose education had been interrupted, but who was not going to let that stop him. Hester noticed, watching those reading sessions, that he occasionally mispronounced a word and then quietly corrected himself. She mentioned it once gently, saying that she had brought quite a few books from St. Louis when she came west, and that she would be glad to read with him if he ever had interest. He looked at her with an expression that had some vulnerability in it. I read well enough, he said. I read better than I used to. I know, she said. I am not saying otherwise. I am saying I would enjoy it. After a pause, I would enjoy it too. They read together many evenings that winter. Lily eventually included herself in this as well, sitting between them on the settle with Pear, adding commentary at intervals that was not always directly related to the text but was invariably earnest. Oscar began to build things. He had a craftsman's relationship with wood that Hester had not fully seen, until winter confined him to the barn workshop on the days when the cold was too brutal for outdoor work. He built Lily a proper chair sized to her dimensions, with her name carved carefully into the back. He repaired and reinforced every structural weakness in the house, working systematically from the foundation up. He built Hester a proper worktable for the kitchen, the old one having been a warped and unstable thing since before she arrived. He showed her the worktable when it was finished, quietly, without fanfare, and she ran her hands along the smooth, level surface and felt something in her chest that was pure and uncomplicated and good. "You made this," she said. "I thought you could use it," he said. She kissed him in the middle of the kitchen in the winter afternoon light, and Lily, who had come in from the other room, said again, with the weary sophistication of a nearly 3-year-old who had seen this particular event occur before. "Yes, again," Hester told her, and Oscar laughed, which was a sound that had come easier over the winter, low and warm and real. They married in the spring. It was a small wedding because the wedding that fit their life was small. Agnes Polk and her husband attended, and Harrison from the ranch to the north, and Alina Aldridge came all the way from Laramie, which was the gift of it, the proof of what genuine feeling looks like in action. Clara could not come, the distance and the season made it impossible, but she sent a letter that arrived the morning of the wedding and which made Hester laugh and cry in the same 2 minutes. Marshal Aiken attended as well, which surprised them both. He had been in the territory for the last stages of the Briggs prosecution, and had stopped at the farm twice over the winter on legitimate business, and once simply because he was passing nearby and wanted to see that things were well. He was, Hester had decided, a man who took his work personally in the best possible way. Briggs had been formally charged with land fraud and conspiracy in January. His trial was scheduled for the summer in Oklahoma City. The lawyer from Oklahoma City whom Hester had telegraphed in October had formally taken on the prosecution's supporting documentation, and Aiken was confident. The case was solid. The other people Briggs had defrauded had come forward once the tide turned, as people so often do when the cost of truth drops below the cost of silence. The wedding was held outdoors, because it was May, and Oklahoma in May could break your heart with its beauty when it chose to. And on that particular Saturday, it chose to. The preacher from Millhaven said the words, and Hester and Oscar said theirs, and Lily stood between them in a new dress that Agnes had sewn, holding pair with great ceremony, and studying the proceedings with the expression of someone witnessing the successful conclusion of a project she had initiated months ago. When the preacher said, "You may kiss the bride," Oscar turned to Hester and took her face in both his hands with that careful, particular tenderness that she had first noticed in a cold, abandoned cabin in the rain, and had never once stopped noticing since, and kissed her in a way that made Agnes Polk produce a handkerchief and Harrison study the middle distance with suspiciously bright eyes. Then they had supper. Alina Aldridge had brought food from Laramie, proper food, a ham and 2 kinds of pie, and they ate outside on boards stretched between sawhorses and talked and laughed, and Lily fell asleep with her head on Oscar's arm before the sun was fully down, and he carried her inside without waking her and came back out to find Hester standing in the doorway watching the last of the sunset with a look on her face that he stood still to memorize. "All right," he said. "More than all right," she said. "Everything." He came to stand behind her, his arms around her, and they watched the sky go from gold to orange to the deep quiet blue of early evening, and the land spread out around them in the cooling air, and it was theirs. The trial of Calhoun Briggs began in July and lasted 3 weeks, and ended with a conviction on 6 counts of land fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy. 2 of his associates were separately charged. The deputy Carver cut a deal and testified for the prosecution, which Hester found distasteful but practical. The judge sentenced Briggs to 12 years. He would serve it in the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. When the verdict came through on the telegram, Hester was standing at her new kitchen worktable preparing supper. Oscar was outside. She went to the door and called his name. He came across the yard and read the telegram over her shoulder. "Good," he said. "Simple and final, like all the best things." She leaned back against him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood like that in the doorway for a while, with the evening air coming in and Lily's voice audible from the yard, where she was engaged in a complex solo game involving sticks and what appeared to be a court of law presided over by Pear. The summer was full and good and hard in the ordinary way of farming summers, which are hard the way good things are hard, because they require your whole self in return something proportional. The cattle herd grew. Oscar broke 2 new horses and trained them with a patience and gentleness that Hester watched from the fence with something between admiration and love, unable to separate the two. The south fence held. The well held. The house held. Clara came in September. She arrived on the stage from Guthrie, having taken the train from St. Louis, and she was everything Hester's letters had promised: energetic and funny and sharp-eyed, with a quality of joyful attention that made everyone in a room feel interesting. She studied Oscar for approximately 2 hours with the frank assessment of a woman who loves her sister and has strong opinions, and then she told Hester privately, while Oscar was tending the horses, that she approved, that he was exactly right, and that she was glad the drifter had carried the letter. "That is a strange way to put it," Hester said. "No, it isn't," Clara said. "Think about it. A man you had never met carried your husband's dying confession 4 months across the frontier because he decided it was right. That is not ordinary. That is not something you ignore." "I did not ignore it," Hester said. "No," Clara agreed, laughing. "You married it. The autumn brought a daughter. She was born in November, early but not alarmingly so, and she was small and red-faced and completely herself from the first moment, announcing her presence with the same forceful clarity her sister had. They named her Ruth, after Oscar's mother, who had died when he was young and whose memory he carried quietly and with great care. Lily inspected the baby with professional seriousness and determined that she was acceptable, and then placed Pear next to the baby's blanket as a gesture of formal welcome. Oscar held Ruth that first night with his hands that had split wood and repaired fences and built furniture, and carried a letter across 3 states. And he held her with such extraordinary care that Hester watched from her bed and felt the particular joy of seeing a person receive something they had not known they were missing. "She is extraordinary," he said. "They both are," Hester said. He looked at her across the lamplight with everything he had ever felt written plainly on his face, because he had never been a man who hid things when there was no reason to, and she had loved that about him since October in a boarding house in Laramie, when he held her hand for the first time. Winter settled over the Oklahoma territory with its particular weight, but the house was warm and solid, and the stove was sufficient, and there were 4 of them now in it. 5 if you counted Pear, and Lily had recently informed Oscar that Pear needed her own chair, which meant he was already planning it in the workshop. He came to Hester one evening in January with a question he had clearly been carrying for a while. He sat down at the kitchen table and folded his hands on the worktable's smooth surface and said, "I want a file on the adjacent 40 acres, the parcel to the west. Harrison says it has been empty 3 years and he believes it can be homesteaded." She looked at him. "You want to expand." "I want to build something," he said, with a directness that was entirely him. "Not for ambition, for them." He glanced toward the back room where both girls were sleeping. "And for you, for us, I want to build something that lasts past us." She thought of what he had told her the second night on the trail north about wanting a farm of his own, a thing he could tend and watch grow, about how it had seemed like something that happened to other people. "File the claim," she said. He looked at her with that expression she could never fully describe except that it made her understand, every time she saw it, that she was someone's whole reason. "Thank you," he said. "You have given me everything," she told him. "You gave me the truth about my life, and you gave yourself, and you gave those girls something I could not have given them alone. The thanks go the other way." He reached across the table and took her hand. She turned hers over and held his, the same gesture as the first time in Laramie, the shape of them together unchanged. "I carried a letter," he said. "The rest was not a sacrifice. The rest was the best luck I have had in my entire life." "I know," she said. "Me too." Outside, the Oklahoma wind moved through the long grass. The cattle were settled in the winter pasture. The new 40 acres to the west waited under the stars, patient as land always is, ready for whatever the people who claimed it were willing to build. The lamp burned steadily in the window, a fixed point in the enormous dark of the American frontier, warm against the cold and strong against the wind, the kind of light that says, "Someone lives here. Someone stays." Ruth slept in her cradle. Lily slept in her small bed with Pear on the pillow beside her. Oscar sat across the table from Hester with his hand in hers, and outside the winter pressed against the walls and found them solid, and inside the fire burned and the years ahead lay open like the land they had claimed, wide and full of work and entirely, unapologetically theirs. Clara came back the following spring with her husband Thomas, whom she had married in January, a steady and good-humored man who got along with Oscar immediately on the basis of shared practical knowledge and a mutual willingness to fix whatever needed fixing without discussion. Clara held Ruth with the besotted attention of a new aunt and told Lily 3 times that she was brave and smart, which Lily received each time as simply accurate information. Thomas and Oscar rode the West 40 together and came back talking about crop rotation, with an animation that made Hester and Clara exchange the particular glance of women who find the men they love deeply satisfying. In May of 1888, 2 years after Oscar had ridden up the dirt road with road dust in every crease of his face, and a letter her dead husband had written, Hester stood in her kitchen at the new worktable kneading bread, while Ruth slept on a blanket in a patch of morning sun on the floor, and Lily sat at her small chair drawing something complicated with a stick of charcoal. And Oscar came in from outside with fresh eggs and set them on the counter and kissed her on the side of her head and said good morning. She leaned into him for a moment, flour on her hands, and thought about letters and distances, and the things people carry, and the things they choose to put down. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "October," she said, 2 years ago. He understood immediately. He always did. He turned her gently from the bread and put his arms around her, flour and all, and held her. "Best decision I ever made," he said. "Carrying the letter?" she asked. "Staying," he said. She put her forehead against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady and present and here. Lily looked up from her drawing. "You are doing the hugging again," she observed. "Yes," said Hester and Oscar together. Lily considered this. She looked at her drawing. She looked back at them. "Pear thinks it is fine," she announced, with the authority of someone closing the matter, and went back to her work. Ruth woke up in her patch of sun and announced herself to the room. Outside, the Oklahoma spring was coming in green and broad and generous, the kind of spring that makes you understand why people crossed impossible distances and started over and kept going, the kind of spring that justifies everything it cost to get there. The bread would be ready by noon. The new 40 acres were planted with winter wheat that was starting to show. The cattle were gaining weight on the new spring grass. The south fence held. Hester Ford, who had become Hester Holloway in a May ceremony under an open Oklahoma sky, looked at her kitchen and her children and her husband, and felt the particular satisfaction of a life that had been dragged through darkness and confusion and grief, and had arrived, through honesty and work and the improbable grace of a stranger keeping a promise, at something solid and warm and entirely real. She went back to the bread. Oscar went back to the eggs. Ruth babbled at the ceiling. Lily drew her picture. The morning continued in its ordinary, irreplaceable way. It was enough. It was everything.